Well, welcome back to Discipleship Squared. Today, we want to talk about the mechanism by which evolution supposedly works. And that particular mechanism is called natural selection. And what we want to do today is to just talk about that natural selection and how it works. One thing that a lot of people seem to think is that creationists don't believe in natural selection, and that's not true. We want to talk a little bit about it, and then the next video we're going to talk a little bit about how it doesn't necessarily mean that evolution is true. So the question that we want to talk about today is there the mechanism that makes evolution work? Is it called natural selection, and how does that actually work? Now, natural selection really came about by the guy named Charles Darwin. I'm sure you've all familiar with him. You might not know his background. He actually studied medicine and theology. He was actually thinking about being a pastor, and he was really good in geology classes and in biology classes. And so he decided, instead of going into theology, in 1831, he joined the HMS Beagle. That was a sailing ship. And it was on a trip around the world to make maps. And he was the ship's naturalist. What that meant was that he would go to these islands and collect species of animals and plants and stuff and record them and take pictures or make drawings of them. Probably what made him most famous was one of the places that the Beagle went was the Galapagos Islands, and that's down in the South Pacific. And these islands are quite a ways apart. And when he would go to each one of these islands, he would collect animals and plants and things like that. And one of the things he noticed that there was a difference in finches on different islands. Now, these islands are far enough apart that these finches just don't fly from one island to the other very easily. And so what he noticed was that on certain islands where there were a lot of insects, there were a lot more pointed beak finches. And the pointed beaks help them get insects out of trees and stuff. But on other islands, most of the food was in seeds. And so he noticed over there that he had these heavier beaks that were easier to break the seeds. And you can see in this picture here, there was a lot of different kinds of beaks. But the idea was that he realized that, wow, if you have basically seeds and nuts, and that's what the birds are eating, then this beak was kind of selected for on that particular island, while on the insect islands, you would have these more pointed beaks or some variation of that. And he seemed to think, wow, that's pretty interesting. I wonder if that's why. I wonder if it's because of the food that these differences are. Now, about the same time, he was reading a guy named Thomas Malthus, and he was a mathematician in the 18th century. He's also an economist, and he was studying populations and the principles on how they grow. And what he came to realize was that populations always grow larger than their food supply. And that, of course, then creates hunger and disease, and there's a struggle for competition because the population is bigger than the amount of food. And so some people live and other people die. Well, Darwin was the first one to really take that principle and apply it to the natural world and animals and plants. And so what he came up with was this idea called natural selection, that evolution happens through natural selection. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, every population has variety. That's called genetic variation. And it's present in a population, and that variation is inherited. So, like, you could do this with a population of kids in school. Like, if I take all the sixth graders in a middle school class, I'm going to have some that are real short. I'm going to have some that are real tall, but most of them are going to be kind of in the middle. There's a variety. Everybody isn't the same height. When I used to dissect fish, we dissected perch in high school biology, and we would always measure all of the perch that we dissected. And what we found is most of them were about the same size. They were kind of average size, but there was a few that would be a little bigger and a few that would be a little smaller. And you can do this with any population, and most populations have what we call a bell-shaped curve. And what that means is that there are a few really short or small, there are a few that are really large, but most are in the middle. Now, the idea here is that as Malthus said, living things overproduce. And so Charles Darwin said that's true of animals as well. They overproduce. And so you have competition for the limited resources that there are. So they compete for food, they compete for space to live and space to nest, and that only the fittest of those survive. What do I mean by fittest? Well, whatever their trait that they happen to have that helps them to survive, they're the ones that are going to survive. So only the fittest to survive, they are the ones that pass on their traits to the offspring. Okay. So if, like, say in this picture, you got a praying mantis and you have all these little baby praying mantises, well, there's too many of them for all the food and stuff, and there's predators that attack them and stuff. And so the ones that are best fitted for their environment will survive. And when they survive, then they pass on their traits to the offspring. The ones that don't survive, well, they basically die out. They don't survive. They don't pass on their traits to their offspring. Now, Darwin knew from just looking at domesticated animals that this principle kind of worked even there. I don't know, many of you may not realize, but the basically we think our dogs, all the dogs that we have today, basically came from the gray wolf. We believe that wolves were probably the first domesticated dog kind, so to speak. And then what happened was people would interbreed them. They would, maybe they would have a couple that would, maybe they had a couple wolves that were really, really big, and then they had a couple that were really small, and they might breed them to get like an average sized dog. And then some of them might have had a particular kind of muscle structure, and so they might breed those, and so they would get different ones. Now, you can see in this picture, these are all just all the different kinds of dogs that you can get. I mean, think about it. You can get a Chihuahua and you can get like a Saint Bernard. Now, those can't really breed very well in the wild. In other words, a Chihuahua is so small it can't hardly even mount a Saint Bernard. So they probably couldn't breed naturally very well, but artificially we separate them and breed them. And so that brings out certain traits. And so Darwin realized we got all these different kinds of animals here, or not different kinds of animals, but different kinds of dogs, all these different shapes and sizes just from breeding them and inbreeding and selectively breeding this gray wolf. And if you take dogs and you just let them breed by themselves and there's no natural thing, we don't really control that breeding, they will actually eventually turn back into a wolf-like dog. Now, we've done this with all kinds of animals. I grew up in dairy country up in New York State. Most of the people that I knew had cattle, and they were mostly Holstein cattle. Holstein cattle give a lot of milk. They have they produce a lot of milk. Most of the guys that I knew milk cows every day, a couple times a day. Now, a lot of people also had Guernsey cows. Guernsey cows didn't give as much milk, but they gave richer milk. They had more cream in their milk. Some cattle raisers up where I grew up, they didn't actually worry about milking cows. Instead, they raised cows for beef. And you can see a couple different types of beef here. This particular one down here is kind of related a little bit more to the longhorn beef. It could actually survive a little bit more out in the wild than these ones. But all of these things are different kinds of cows. And evolutionists say, if we can make different kinds of cows like this, obviously, if we let this thing go on long enough, over millions of years, you might actually not have a cow anymore. Now, can this happen in nature? Well, yeah, it can happen in nature. What we call that is geographic isolation. And that can happen several ways. You can have a river that cut through an area and separated populations just by separating those breeding populations, or a mountain range might do that, or maybe large bodies of water. One of the common examples that evolutionists point to is the Abert and the Kaibab squirrel. They live on either side of the Grand Canyon. So supposedly 10,000 years ago, the Colorado River began separating the two squirrel populations. And eventually that became the Grand Canyon. And so what happened was the kaibab squirrels were on one side of the canyon, the aberts were on the other, and so what happened was some of their genes got separated from each other. So you can see here they have these really tall ears and tufts and stuff, and they have a different coloration, and they have a different kind of a tail, and they actually ate different types of food. And the kaibab squirrel is still there today, and it has a lot different characteristics than the Abert squirrel, which is on the other side of the canyon. And it eats different food and has different courtship rituals and stuff. And in fact, these two populations don't even interbreed anymore because of the way that they've developed their mating habits and stuff. Now, you can take the sperm from one and the egg from another, and you can artificially inseminate them, and you can still get the squirrels. But the deal is, nature literally separated these squirrels. There was one kind of squirrel there before the Grand Canyon, and there was a whole other kind of squirrel, two different kinds of squirrel after the Grand Canyon. And so again, this is an example of where evolutionists say, hey, you can obviously see that evolution is working. This is just the beginnings of it. And it takes hundreds of generations for it to change from one animal into another. And again, here you can see the Grand Canyon, obviously having a huge canyon like this, which is almost a mile deep and stuff, it's going to separate these populations. And we have a separation of populations today. And so evolutionists point to this as a good example of the beginning of the evolution of a squirrel into something else. Another common example, one of the most famous ones, it's almost in every textbook that you see, is the peppered moth, Bistonbitularia. There are two forms of it. There is a lighter colored form, kind of speckled, light colored gray, and then there's a darker form, which is almost black. And you can see that these stand out differently depending on the background where they land. Here's a dark colored tree and the light one stands out, and here's a light colored tree and the dark one stands out. And then, like say the green leaves, both of them stand out. So the idea here is that perhaps the color of this would protect it. In other words, this one here, the dark one, would blend in. So if most of the trees were dark, then the light ones would be at risk. They wouldn't survive because the predators could see them easier and eat them. But the dark ones would survive. And then if you had light colored trees, it would be just the opposite. This would be the one that would be selected against by nature. This one would be the one that's selected for. And so only the fittest one, the one that blended in best, would survive. An interesting study was done just outside of London. Before the Industrial Revolution, most of the trees around London, there was a lot of white birch trees. And so you had all these white birch trees, and most of the population, they did a study of the population of this moth, and about 80% of them were the light colored variety, and only about 20% were the dark colored variety. And why was that? Well, because the birds obviously were able to pick off the dark ones easier than the light ones. So the light one was selected for it. It was the fittest, so it survived. But then the Industrial Revolution happened, and around the area around London, this was before pollution controls and stuff. So all these trees got really, really dark, almost like black. And now all of a sudden, and they did another study about, in the I think it was 1880s or so. And they did a study, and here all of these, most of the moths were now dark colored ones. And the reason why is because they were the selected to survive because they blended in with their environment. So those were the ones that made it and passed on to their offspring. The light colored ones, not too many of them made it. And so consequently, it went from over here, it was 80-20 white. Now it was 80-20 black were the most common ones. And then, and I don't have a slide to indicate this, but in the last few years, like in the last 30 or 40 years, they put all the pollution controls back onto the smokestacks and stuff. And now the trees are more white again, and that population is starting to shift back again, where there's more white ones than black. I think it was Encyclopedia Britannica said this is one of the best examples of evolution you can have in the world. You can see a population is changing. One small change can change the whole amount of population. And of course, evolutionists say that it's little changes that build up over many millions of or thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. You can get a change into a completely different organism. Another example that we often see today is um, what happens when we use insecticides to control crops. What happens is when you spray an insecticide on most of the animals, when they first are exposed to insecticide, they die off. But there's always a few, just maybe a few, maybe a couple or 3% of the animals, the insects, they will survive because they happen to have a genetic thing in them that resists that insecticide. And so what will happen is when you spray an insecticide on a field, about 95% of them will be dead that first year. I mean, it just kills them off. But there's a few that survive. Well, since they survive, they pass on to their offspring, and then they pass on to their offspring. And so what happens is the second year, the insecticide still works pretty good. It still maybe kill off 92% of the insects, but a few more survive. And then the next year, a few more survive. And so then what happens is you have less effectiveness in the insecticide. Usually after about 7 or 8 years, you got to change insecticide or else make it a lot stronger because it doesn't kill off anymore because of this natural resistance that happened. And how did that happen? Well, it was just by chance. And some of these insects just happen to inherit a particular thing that help resist that antibiotic or that resist that insecticide. Same thing has happened with antibiotics today in bacteria. We have fought bacteria off for a lot of years with antibiotics, but now some of the antibiotics don't work very well anymore at normal strengths. In fact, some of the things like penicillin, we have to use about 1,000 times more stronger penicillin today in order to kill off bacteria that we used to kill off with just like, about, a tenth of a percent of what we're using today. So that is what basically natural selection is, that the animals survive and only the fittest survive. And if you have these little changes over many generations, evolutionists say, then that would be big changes. So, with a peppered moth, we might change the color for a while, and then we might change the size or maybe the wing structure, and then we might change the mouth structure depending on whether it was able to help it survive. And over many, many generations, a small change, just one small change, if they build up and you got a whole bunch of changes, it might not even look like the original animal anymore. Here's an example that evolutionists often use. It's the horse. They believe that the horse evolved, today's horse, Equus, evolved from a little critter called Eohippus. Eohippus was a four-toed critter. It was a small thing, about the size of a rabbit or maybe a fox, somewhere in that neighborhood. And as best we can tell, it probably escaped animals and predators by jumping into like thickets, like briars and stuff, and getting away from critters that were trying to follow it. But then we find over a period of time, so we find these fossils where this four-toed thing seems to change, and we ended up having two of the toes fused together. And by the time it gets to this point, it can actually carry quite a little bit more weight. So Mesohippus and Mercy Hippus, it actually could get longer legs because it could support more weight. And so what happened was, if you got longer legs, now you don't have to worry about jumping into a thicket. In fact, you're maybe too big for that, but you have longer strides, and so you can run away. And then as this one toe got bigger and bigger, we had these bigger sized animals that seemed to start to really look like a horse. And they basically had like a hoof and just two toes. And eventually the horse just got one hoof. So what we're doing is we're just basically changing four toes into three toes, and then three toes into basically one big toe and little side toes, and then eventually a hoof. And by doing that, you change the way that the animal could protect itself. A horse can run away from a pack of wolves, and if there's only a couple wolves, it can defend itself just by hitting and kicking the wolves with its hooves, whereas this animal couldn't. And so the idea here is that you're changing into a completely different animal because of because of this survival of the fittest. It's easy to see how these longer legs might help this critter survive better than, say, this critter in the same way here. So the evidence suggests that natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. And so a lot of evolutionists say, well, why do we need a creator then to explain life as we know it? I mean, the evidence just, supports this idea of evolution. Or does it? Well, that's what our next video will talk about. We're going to talk about the problems with that and what natural selection is and what it actually isn't. And so we'll be sharing that.